folks. Well, I'm so glad to have you all here. We wanted to have this great communion of all of our not-for-profit folks who are slogging away in the trenches of the immigration world. And so I'm glad to have you all here. I think probably it makes most sense for everybody to introduce themselves rather than me go through a massive introductions, and maybe just tell the world where you're working with. That will be fun for you, Amanda. What you're doing and where you've been. Why don't we start with you?
Really?
Yeah. How are you?
Okay. All right. Hi. Thanks for having us. I'm so excited. I feel like this is like we've been watching your podcast and watching you engage with all sorts of issues. So it's really exciting. Plus, it's just so nice to be in your presence, even if we're not in each other's presence for real. So I am a staff lawyer at the Migrant Workers Center. I guess that's primarily how I identify myself, but also, of course, do some other work with legal aid on refugee law cases. And most recently, I've been working on this out-of-status construction worker project with the Canadian Labour Congress in the GTA, which has been a whole world unto itself. So it's been interesting, and yeah.
Okay. What about you, Juliana?
Yes, thank you so much, Deanna, for gathering us all together. It's lovely to see so many friendly, familiar faces. Yeah, so I'm Juliana. I am I'm currently the clinic director acting for the Immigration and Refugee Legal Clinic. And I've been with the Immigration and Refugee Legal Clinic for just over 3 years. I joined as a staff lawyer in December 2020. Before that, I worked as a staff lawyer also at the Migrant Workers Center, overlapping briefly with Amanda. And prior to that, I was in private practice as an immigration and refugee lawyer. And I also did my articles and worked at Community Legal Assistance Society as an anti-poverty lawyer, public interest lawyer as well. So that's my background.
Fun fact, Julianne and I just follow each other around, actually, is typically what we're doing. We've taken a pause for now, but yeah.
I did a little leapfrogging.
Oh, let's hear from you, John.
Yeah, my name is Jonathan Braun. I'm the legal director and a staff lawyer at the Migrant Workers Center. I came back to the Migrant Workers Center after Juliana left, so I swooped into her vacant position. And I was with the organization back when it was called West Coast Domestic Workers Association after law school. So after law school, I was a legal advocate for about 2.5 years there. Left to go article and work in union side labor for a couple of years, and then came back to the staff lawyer position. And yeah, this is a little reunion. Juliana was my clinic head when I was at the Law Students Legal Advice Program at UBC Law, now Allard School of Law. So Juliana was my first upper year kind of mentor in law school. So yeah, reunions all around.
That's right.
The reason that I really wanted to have you all together is to talk about, I mean, I think working in the not-for-profit world in the immigration sector is quite a unique thing. You know, I know from the time when I was in that field that there were sort of like eras where different issues would kind of come through, and that would be a strong focus of the practice for a while, and then it would usher in a whole new era, and that would become a new focus. So I'm curious to hear, what are the key issues that your clients are facing these days? Anybody can just jump in. Are there big specific struggles that are key issues for you?
Maybe I feel like I'm Jonathan, jump in, and then, but I mean, I think just in thinking about the theme, and we've been chatting about what we wanted to talk about today, access to justice. And the first thing actually that came to my mind, and Jonathan, obviously jump in here in terms of the work that we're doing, but we just see so many recruitment fees and just like really, really brutal, people being just like situations of workers being taken advantage of at the Migrant Workers Center, that I feel like it's just something that's on my mind a lot in terms of how do you help these mostly low-wage workers with getting justice, I guess, in these situations where they've paid huge amounts of recruitment fees or agency fees or representative fees, and then show up in Canada to no job. I was just, before coming onto this podcast, working on an application for someone who came with a work permit as a farm worker, but the job didn't exist when she arrived in Canada, and after paying $40,000 of fees to get work authorization. So I feel like, yeah, I mean, that's one of the big things I think that we see often at the Migrant Worker Center is just like, unfortunately, this sort of area of like fraud and in recruitment, and then an inability for these workers to get justice when these agencies disappear.
Mm.
So
Yeah,
you're
I think
seeing a
that
mix of both people paying for jobs that don't exist as well as paying for jobs that do exist, which is also not allowed.
Yeah, most definitely. And I mean, I think part of it is like, there are some themes I think around when the jobs don't exist, that those tend to be like really, really high fees, or if it often it can be like, a worker's coming saying, thinking that they're coming to do an engineering job or something. Like we've seen a few of these situations from Vietnam, for example, where workers will come who are trained or educated and think that they're coming to do some job and then get issued a work permit as a farm worker or something.
And
But
those
yeah,
people, like, do they tell you, some guy's coming from, say, Vietnam and paying 40,000 for a job that doesn't exist? Where are they getting the 40,000? Like, are they going into debt to possibly unscrupulous lenders in their home country, or?
yeah, I mean, I think that typically is what we hear. And maybe I'm going to throw it to you, Jonathan, because I know you've represented a bunch of these workers. But I often
yeah,
see them like transitioning and making refugee claims because they're, like actually very, very scared to return to Vietnam because they are getting the money from these unscrupulous loan sharks.
yeah, we've seen the loan shark issue. A lot of people relying on their families, relying on their personal savings, basically selling their properties, getting their parents to sell their properties. So they're sold this dream of coming to Canada and what that will mean for them and their families. And so often the entire family is rallying behind them to assist them with this opportunity, thinking that this is in everybody's best interest, thinking that it's a genuine route to a job in Canada, then permanent residence in Canada, when obviously it's often not. So yeah, so it's sometimes loan sharks, sometimes like everybody in the family is just putting everything they have into this one person.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think that's where we see it intersecting a little bit with our work as well at the Immigration Refugee Legal Clinic, which is, we do work on refugee as well as immigration issues that are, either not covered by or difficult to serve effectively within the traditional legal aid system. So, you have situations of folks who, have, as you say, come to Canada, have, spent their life savings, have, leveraged in borrowed money. Their entire families are depending on them. They can't go back, and they are in Canada with no pathway to permanent residency, with, with recruitment debt that they need to pay, with no means of lawful work authorization, sometimes undocumented, sometimes, with work permits, but non-compliant, so at risk of removal. And, we see folks in this situation like every day. And we are, we're a small clinic. We have, just a small number of staff lawyers, and so we can't even come close to meeting the need. We try to refer, as much as we can to legal aid for, like we'll do summary advice appointments for folks and say, okay, these are your options. You can make an application for a temporary resident permit. You can make an application for humanitarian and compassionate considerations. But without effective legal representation for these applications, folks are at a really high risk of facing removal enforcement. And so, we try to do the best we can in terms of referring what we can to legal aid, taking on what we can, but there's such a huge unmet need. And that is only growing, with the large numbers of temporary residents that have been admitted in past years as, international students and workers, like on the promise of, thinking they have a pathway to permanent residency, and some may, but like many don't. And it's it's a struggle. We see a lot of cases of international students who are deeply in debt and working to support themselves and facing mental health struggles, and can't maintain their studies. So they drop out of school. They become non-compliant for a variety of reasons. They may be unable to return to their countries, and basically it leaves them with very little options. So I think those are, just like the access to justice crisis really is the theme that runs throughout all of this, I think.
One thing that I find always comes up in these sorts of cases is the question of culpability. And I think that that's something that I always really struggled with, and I still always struggle with, this question of whether or not the person has come to the situation with clean hands. And I think part of the problem from my perspective is that it's so challenging for people to make their way to Canada in the first place, and often there are so many drivers that make it impossible for them to remain in their country of origin, and that's what makes them susceptible to, there's a fine line sometimes between unlawful recruitment and human trafficking. And so I'm just wondering if that has that the needle has been moved on that at all, or if there's still a very strong sense that if you fall prey to an unlawful or an unethical recruitment, that it's kind of on you, and now you kind of bear the consequences of that.
Can you elaborate? Like, what do you mean by unclean hands?
Well, just in my experience in the past of working with people who have been subject to kind of grievous exploitation by recruiters, that the department has been unwilling to support in terms of recognizing them as being victims of exploitation, because they've said, well, you should have known a $30,000 fee for recruitment means you should have been wise to the fact that this was not a genuine job offer. Sort of not cognizant of the fact that when there are dozens of organizations or people peddling these types of things and just saying this is the price to come to Canada, that people just understand that this is what they can expect to pay for it. So again, there's a lot of did you call the employer? Did you do this? This was my experience when I was working with the West Coast Domestic Workers Association many years back, that there was a lower willingness to recognize the impact of the exploitation when there was a lot of you should have known, you should have understood. And I just wonder whether or not that has changed in any way.
I don't think so. I mean, I feel like we do, a big part of the work that we do now at the Migrant Workers Center is helping people with vulnerable worker open work permits, which obviously since 2019, the announcement of that new program, it feels like we've sort of shifted, almost like the bulk of our work is now just helping workers apply for these vulnerable worker open work permits. And I think our experience, and maybe Jonathan, let me know if this is different for you, but often we're putting forward these recruitment fees as a form of financial abuse, because of course the regulations, the financial abuse is one of the enumerated kinds of abuse that would lead to a ground for this kind of application. It feels like it feels like officers sort of twist themselves in all sorts of ways to just avoid having to deal with whether or not, $40,000 US fee is a recruitment fee, or, and I know at the beginning, definitely in the beginning of this program, when we were working on some of these applications, it was even more egregious. And in that, yeah, we would see immigration officers saying, well, you paid this fee willingly, so, you know, you should have this, you weren't coerced to pay this fee. That can't be a form of financial abuse because you willingly paid this fee. And, but it does feel like we're seeing a little bit less of that these days.
Mm.
I don't know. I'm not,
Yeah.
I
I mean, back in the day when people were coming with work permit approvals and they would call the employer at the port of entry and say, oh, you don't know about this job offer, and they would remove the worker and sometimes make misrepresentation allegations. I mean, that was at the height of, I don't know if those sorts of things are still happening, but I mean, even right now, they've made this recent announcement that caregivers are going to be able to get permanent residence on arrival, and yet they're still saying that they're going to have a requirement of a job offer. So again, there's still this this sense that there's this need, like again, they seem to be growing in awareness that the need to sort of demonstrate this tie to a Canadian employer is leading to a lot of exploitation. And yet, even though there's there's a recognition of permanent residence on arrival, there's still a stated intention to show that you have a job offer, and an employer who needs to show that they're on the hook and that they're taking responsibility. So again, I sometimes I'm like, are we moving forward? Or are we still staying in this same paradigm?
Yeah.
Yeah. I think
sorry.
Go ahead, Jonathan.
There you go. You go.
I was going to say, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think we're still entrenched within this paradigm of, you know, the this focus on like who is a deserving victim, and you know who is and who is not. And I think it's a really problematic, it's a really problematic dichotomy. And I think it's something that comes directly out of you know, obviously the history of Canadian immigration law is fundamentally exclusionary, racist, classist, etc. One of the things that, you know, it's interesting, this has shaped the way that I like write H&C applications now. So I will put in evidence, including in some cases expert evidence, on you know, the social context in which this person found themselves and the choices that they had available to them, and how those choices were limited by, you know, factors that are, you know, that are very complex. And ultimately, you know, our job as advocates, you know, is to make the best case we can for our clients. But I think you're right that there's this tension in that where, you know, where it does, we have to fight against this dichotomy of like, these people are you know, these clients or these applicants are deserving of equitable relief, and you know, like who isn't deserving of compassionate, equitable relief, right? You know, if we look at the, you know, the situations of like, I had a client who I did a PR application for, who had like 65 criminal convictions in Canada, you know, serious crim. And he was, you know, had suffered his entire life with addiction, mental health struggles that were the direct result of like unspeakable trauma experienced as a child in his home country, you know, coming to Canada without, you know, family support, and living a life, you know, in struggle with that. And so, you know, like people are just so much more, every individual is so much more complex than one choice or, you know, one thing that happened to them. Everyone has a story. And, you know, I mean, I think this is one of the things I like about the work, is that we can help people tell these stories. And also, I wish that there was a world in which we didn't have to, you know, write a 40-page submission, you know, with documented by 400 pages of country conditions evidence and, you know, medical evidence and psychological evidence to support why this person deserves to stay, because, you know, because that's not, that can't happen in every case. There just isn't, you know, the resourcing to do that. So then people fall through the cracks.
For sure.
I feel like that's yeah. And I mean, I think that's the issue. It's like, our clinic can only do so much, your clinic can only do so much. And then of course, we've got the sort of private bar friends. I know many of you do low bono work, try to take on work from people who can't afford to pay legal fees. But yeah, there's just such a huge need. And I think it just feels so depressing to sit with somebody after you've heard this terrible story. They've lost their status because the employer has decided, despite saying over and over again that they're going to help with a new LMIA to get a new work permit for this worker. Never happens. Eventually the worker leaves and is without status. And yeah, ultimately, I feel like our advice is like your option really is to do a humanitarian and compassion application. But where do you send that person to get support? Legal aid is not funding a lot of these applications anymore, especially if they can't figure out what the risk is back in the person's country of origin. So it is depressing. And yeah, I feel like there's just this huge amount of unmet need in terms of these people that don't fit into the sort of very specific scenarios that our clinic serves or that your clinic is able to serve, and that legal aid is funding.
Did you have something you wanted to add, Jonathan?
I mean, I have things that I could add to some of those different topics. I don't know if we're wanting to like move linearly here, but I think to the topic of the open work permits and what officers are accepting and not accepting, I'll say I have found that officers seem to be generally willing to, when somebody's paid, from my experience, when somebody's paid significant recruitment fees for a job that didn't exist, those open work permits, with some exceptions, have typically been approved from my experience. But the whole open work permit system, it's like we have to basically tell people in meetings, oh, well, immigration's not going to think you were up, like your abuse was enough. And it's such a messed up thing to say to somebody because, they're obviously experiencing what to them is really traumatic and really difficult. Like maybe they were told they were going to get paid $20 an hour, but they're only paid 18. Like that is a big deal. That's like they're having money stolen from them every hour that they work, but like immigration doesn't seem to care. Or maybe they were supposed to work in one job, and even though that would be against their work permit, they're required to work in another job. Again, immigration doesn't really seem to care. And so, these people are going through these really traumatic, difficult experiences. And we as legal providers have to be like, yeah, you can apply for this work permit. It is free to apply for. But, right now you're going to be putting a lot of work into that. They're not even going to give you an answer for 4 to 5 months, it seems like now, because they're taking forever with these applications. And at the end of the day, they're not even going to tell you why they rejected it. They're just going to give you a one-line answer of, oh, we didn't think it was enough. Like, I'm not convinced that you suffered abuse. And so even from that perspective, allowing somebody to kind of know how to proceed with their own immigration file if they can't get help from a clinic or legal aid or can't afford a lawyer, they don't even know where to start because the information provided from immigration is so limited. Like, how is somebody, who's spilled their guts out saying like, I've suffered this abuse, and all immigration cares to say is no. And
So
that's really what the answer that they're getting. And it's really cruel, and it really prevents somebody from knowing what to do, because if they had the reasons, the proper reasons, maybe they'll know how to improve their application and provide a different one on their own. Or maybe they'll know that maybe, hey, it's not worth proceeding, but we're not actually provided any guidance on that, and the individuals aren't either.
Yeah, like you have to file a federal court, like, application for judicial review to get the reasons. And, so if the, if Migrant Worker Center happens to have a capacity to do that, or we do, like, and then we take the case to federal court, hoping to, get like a good decision from the federal court to give guidance to officers on like, hey, this reasoning is, it's not transparent. It's contrary to the policy guidelines. It's contrary to the purpose of the intent of the regulation. And then the case is settled. And so, even if somebody can get in through the door, then, it doesn't have, I think it's a challenge to have the systemic impact impact that we want these cases to have. And then of course, even if your client is, successful in their open work permit application on, a redetermination, it's only valid for 1 year. And that's not enough time to do, to retain a lawyer, prep an H&C application, submit the H&C application, get it to first stage approval so that they can benefit from the work permit and the stay of removal. So it's not enough time. So, even if people are successful, like they're not always fully. So it's a real challenge.
So a question that I can imagine some listeners are probably asking is, why don't they just go back to their home countries? So they came here for a job opportunity, an opportunity that turned out to basically just be abuse. What's motivating them to stay in Canada instead of going back to wherever they're from?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, if you've spent all that money for a job in Canada, your family has gone into debt, you've gone into debt under the promise that you're going to be earning the wages you'd earn in Canada, that might not be possible to you in the country that you came from. Staying in Canada and hoping to make it work, hoping to get that open work permit and get back to work might be your only way of paying back those loan sharks or paying down that debt. And so, people are desperate to get back to work, because that's why people often come here is to work and to earn money and send it back to their family, and support themselves. And so people stick around often hoping to actually be able to legally do that, and so that they can pay off the debt that they paid to get here.
And I think the reality is, as well, is that, the forces that make people vulnerable to labor trafficking and labor exploitation are the factors of why they want to leave their countries and come to Canada for a better life in the first place. So, I think there's often a complexity around, okay, well, our clinic works at the intersection of, refugee protection and, other forms of humanitarian protection. And so, when we're providing summary legal advice, we will often look at, okay, does this person have a refugee claim, a valid claim for protection under Section 96 or 97 of the Act? Do they, do they maybe have a claim, but it's not clear how it would be decided? And, are the forces that have put them in the situation where they felt they had no option but to leave their country and pay all this money, or or enter into a relationship that turned out to be abusive. So those factors can often be complex, and the law doesn't really provide always a clear answer for that through the refugee determination system. Sometimes it does, but it does require a bit of careful unpacking and careful trust building and work with and sitting with clients to understand like the full picture of their story and all the forces at work. I know I can think of cases where on first glance it seems like, well, why is it not an option to go back to your country, especially if it's not a country that's typically a refugee producing country. And often people are, if you take the time to listen to their stories, there's all kinds of really complex factors in play, whether from childhood exposure to trauma, family violence, sexual violence, and just general conditions of inequality in that are being faced. So it's often like a really complex question.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
For sure. And I think there's a lot of that's a dense answer that you've provided, Juliana. It raises a lot of things for me. The thing about making a refugee claim, even beyond the question of whether or not the refugee claim will be successful, from the outset, making a refugee claim means saying you will basically never be able to return to that country. And so from the outset, for people to say, okay, I know that I will never be able to return, see my parents who might be elders. I mean, that is a huge barrier for people, the idea of having to traverse the refugee system. A lot of people also just don't see themselves as refugees because they don't see themselves as wishing to avail of what they see as being a handout, as a charitable thing. They want to be workers, they want to be economic immigrants, and they have a real barrier against saying, I am going to ask for this compassionate kind of a favor. They want to be able to be accepted on their merits as a worker. And one of the things that always has really bumped for me, and this is something we talked about way back. I remember when we had Professor Asha Kaushal on the show, is just the way that we've kind of factored in economic immigration. It so privileges skilled work, and yet when you see many of the clients that come through, they're working 2 full-time jobs, you know, and so for them there can be a real hard time just understanding, why is it that this effort that I'm putting in, this great contribution to Canada, is not considered to be sufficient. And so I just remember, well, even now when I work with people that are in the kind of low income sector, just this not understanding why this contribution is not considered to be giving the same degree of establishment as somebody who's a property owner, who has a huge income because they're doing jobs that perhaps are not as desirable to Canadians, but do, you know, I think it goes back to the question of what is citizenry and in the more kind of broad sense.
It's funny. Oh, sorry.
No, please go ahead. Please
But
go
what I
ahead.
was going to say, and just Stephen, back to your question, it like both of what you've just said reminded me of, like, I mean, I think part of what we see a lot of is, yeah, just like people feeling like, I mean, sometimes we do see workers that are coming and they don't have a job and then we see them right away. But often, actually, by the time they've come to the Migrant Worker Center, or I'm sure the Immigration and Refugee Legal Clinic, it's like they've actually endured a ton of abuse. So it's like people feeling like they just, you know, you've come to Canada, you've got this, you've, you know, been lucky to be able to get here. And yeah, okay, the working conditions are terrible, but I'm just going to endure and endure and endure until finally they can't endure anymore. And it's just so, I mean, I think part of the issue of like, well, why don't you just, you know, why wouldn't you just go back to your country, besides whatever's happening in that country or in your country that maybe pushed you to come to Canada? I think the other part of that is exactly this, which is like, you know, you've come here, you've endured all these conditions, you've tried your best to like make it work on the promise from an employer that, or on the promise from perhaps a representative that's misled you to believe that if you just work for 12 months in this, you know, low wage position, that you're going to have a pathway to permanent residence. And we all know that that person will not. And so, I mean, I think it just like, there's a sense, I think, of injustice in that, in that, like, I think people just also want to figure out, like, there's got to be a way for me to try to access permanent residence. There's got to be a way for me to get my family here. That was what was promised to me. I've endured all this, you know, abuse and exploitation. And so it's just like, yeah, I feel like frustrated working with these kinds of workers where you're like, okay, you know, I can see this feeling of like a deep sense of injustice of what they've been through. And then, you know, us sitting as representatives, giving them legal advice, saying like, you have very few options, right? Even despite all that you've been through, very few options in terms of like, yeah, how to access permanent status in Canada, and how to even access justice, I think.
On that abuse, how are you and your different organizations finding the system at dealing with the employers? So I saw 2 days ago, I just pulled up I don't know if Service Canada had a press release saying that the volume of fines, or the amount of fines against Canadian companies, was up to 2.1 million in administrative monetary penalties last year.
Mm-hmm.
What those are fines that go to the government. How are you finding the system at getting the people who've been the victims of abuse or lower wages than they were promised and things like that made at least somewhat whole?
Yes.
horrible. It's like the systems are horrible. You know, in British Columbia, like we're often having to file complaints with the Employment Standards Branch, the BC Employment Standards Branch, which honestly I think is just so ill-equipped to actually deal with these issues. And some of the decision makers seem to have very little understanding of the law. So, for example, Migrant Worker Center recently won an appeal where the worker had recordings of the employer stating that they were charged labor market impact assessment fees and stating that they were only going to pay them $9 an hour. And the decision maker in that decision said, "Oh, well, I'm not going to give much weight to those recordings." And they
Was there a
had the
reason? Like, why did they say that?
because the lawyer on the other side said that the translations were not accurate, but they were later found to be.
How do you find
So
the provincial process versus the federal, like the complaints to the temporary foreign worker program?
Takes forever. Like the number one thing
those
I think is just
they like
so
to just say
slow.
that there's no cause or like everything's fine. I think they like to bring people into compliance and give them like tips and tricks to come back into compliance and like, okay, the issue's resolved. Because
Mhm.
even in that report that just came out, they're saying they provided some low number of employers who are never or who are not allowed to hire again, but then like the ban is like 2 years or something. It's like, well, why is somebody who's been found to be abusive and exploitative ever allowed to access the temporary foreign worker program again? Why are we okay with putting people back in those situations after 2 years?
Mhm.
I think it's a very small slap on the wrist to these employers from the federal.
It is hard too because I mean I think we see you'll see a worker one season that comes from a farm where there's horrific abuse that's happening and then we might hear that like okay the Mexican consulate's got involved, Service Canada has showed up and done some inspections and then I think we try to have a bit of hope that that's going to change something and then the following season you see workers again from that same farm saying similar kinds of abuse and it's like well how are our compliance regimes like I get yes of course it's great that it seems like there's more inspections or at least like their Service Canada is aware that this kind of stuff is happening and there needs to be more kind of proactive inspections but yeah like if we're continuing to see workers from the same employers coming back and saying the same things it's like
Yeah.
well, we have a problem like that's whatever those fines are doing it doesn't seem like it's enough to deter the kinds of abuse
Oh, it's like a cost of doing business.
yeah
Yeah.
Like,
And also, I mean, we're seeing definitely that there's an enforcement focus, but nothing that is ameliorative toward the worker. If anything, we are still seeing workers being subject to enforcement for misrepresentation, for working without
Exactly.
status. I mean, there's one case that I think came from one of your organizations, I can't remember which, that I ended up working on, where a poison pen letter from one such abusive employer ended up leading to yet another misrepresentation allegation against someone that, again, it keeps getting defeated, but it was somebody who was subject to a vulnerable worker application by that same employer and ended up making a totally vexatious poison pen allegation that led to like a year of litigation that they ended up being able to defeat. But ultimately, it's like there's no balance here. And I think this focus on enforcement, yes, it's a cash grab for the government where they can actually take this penalty, but the idea that this is for the protection of workers, to me, it's never rang true.
Can you like tell the story a bit more? I think it'd be helpful to kind of hear some of the stories of what goes on. So this was an employer writing to IRCC about an employee?
Yeah, and just made an allegation without any proof. It caused an investigation into an alleged theft with no evidence. And then in the process of this investigation, they ended up making a misrepresentation allegation against him for a non-disclosure that had previously been investigated and found to have no merit. Got raised for a second time. We ended up having to spend months and months in litigation. Eventually, they realized that they had already investigated and found that there was no merit to it and dropped it. It's being raised again for a third time because of this report. And so ultimately, it's just this person is being dogged. And this was a situation where an application for a vulnerable worker work permit had been filed alleging unsafe work conditions, lack of pay, unpaid overtime, like any number of unsafe work conditions. And so, so ultimately, in the face of these two, pieces of evidence, they ended up they've subjected this worker to numerous investigations, inquiries, and not withstanding the fact that this person is married to a Canadian, has a Canadian-born child, and it's been a nightmare.
So
I
if
mean,
somebody goes to you guys or any of your organization and says, okay, I was the victim of abuse, the employer, I was only getting paid $1 per hour. I should have been getting paid $20 per hour. In my permanent residence application or work permit application, I put that I was getting $20 an hour. I'd like to go after the employer. How do you advise them regarding the likelihood that they themselves may find themselves declared inadmissible to Canada for misrep?
This happens, this comes up so much, I think, in the work that we do, and not specifically in the way that you've just described it, but often in a situation where somebody has come to Canada, maybe as a visitor, finds some kind of representative registered or not, and then the representative says, oh, I found you an employer. The employer wants you to do a probationary time to work. So they work with, and it's fine. We've applied for the LMIA and your work permit. So now you're authorized, you're okay to work, and convinces this person that it's okay to like do a bit of work before they get their work permit. And then ends up in an abusive situation and then comes to us. And I feel like we're often telling people, and we do see immigration doing this where the person may have been then issued an employer-specific work permit. They have suffered some horrific abuse, but there's always a caution of, well, in fact, you were not eligible for that first work permit because you worked without authorization. You didn't disclose that. And there is a very genuine risk that immigration will go after you for misrepresentation on your first work permit application that often the worker has never seen, often we're saying, do you have the forms? I need to see what was submitted to immigration before we submit this vulnerable worker open work permit. ATIPs take forever, as we all know. And so, even trying to find that representative or whoever it was that helped that person, it is very, very tricky. And I feel like, we're often just saying like, this is a real risk and it doesn't happen every time. But as Deanna described, definitely, yeah, we've been involved with many situations of workers like that, where then immigration does convene an admissibility hearing and all of a sudden you're in this major process that because there was never a disclosure of whatever happened, that unauthorized work in the first place.
For sure. And I think, to be frank, I think that those who are perpetrating abuse are wise. They understand how to, and those who are repeat offenders, they grow wiser. And so they're clear about not documenting the payment of a recruitment fee. They're clear about making sure that they don't work at the location where the work permit is authorized. So they might have a work permit that is a genuine work permit for a genuine job, but they're going to ask them to work at a different location so that there is a basis for them to threaten a report to immigration so that they can be found inadmissible for unauthorized work or for misrepresentation, whatever the case may be. And so those things are ultimately held over that person's head. And whether or not the department is going to go the direction of culpability or the direction of victimhood, is kind of anybody's guess. It's like it's a crapshoot, and this is the challenge of advising somebody. Either this goes well, but again, the challenge I've always found in advising my clients is that you're aiming for victimhood, which is a very strange position to be in as an advocate. And I think it's not exactly an empowerment model.
Yeah.
And so I think that over the years, I think this is why we talk about burnout, is because trying to work with clients to demonstrate their own victimhood, it's not exactly it's not the way that I would like to be doing advocacy work. I think that, and I don't really know that it's in Canada's best interest to be trying to set people up to describe their own decrepitude as a way of trying to pitch themselves for an exercise of compassion. I do feel like there should be a better way of going about this and talking about deservedness and all of this kind of stuff, as opposed to trying to reach like a race to the bottom. And I think the way that like victimhood, the victims of trafficking in persons, the victims of domestic violence, the vulnerable, and so anyways, this is just my own little rant.
Yeah, totally. It is brutal sometimes, I think, like in this work, and I know we've all experienced this, where you're sitting thinking, evaluating whether or not somebody has good H&C factors, or a good refugee claim, or a good vulnerable worker open work permit. And it's like, it feels a bit like, what is happening here? I'm just waiting for you to say these key things of like how much you suffered to be like, oh, okay.
Okay, that's sad enough. I think that's sad enough. Yeah.
We have,
and again,
we have this running discussion in our office where it's like, when you're interviewing a client and you're trying to understand their story, it's like, it's like this perverse concept where like the worst things that have happened to them are like the best things for their immigration case.
It is.
It really deeply like affects us as like, I think, human beings, like to be, in this situation where where these are the conversations that we're having, and to be able to kind of step out of the advocate role and like be human for a moment and be like, I am horrified that this happened to you, and how can we look to support, and empower, as you say, Deanna. I think that like, and one of the questions that you had talked about, that we could, maybe have a discussion about today was about burnout, and how that is managed and and resisted, or in our organizations. And I think one of the things that I find helps me in combating burnout, although I am no stranger to burnout, is this concept of like, we talk a lot about vicarious trauma, but there's also like vicarious resilience. And I find that the, witnessing the resilience of the folks that we work with and walk with in the work that we do can be sometimes a bit of an antidote, or a force that helps resist the despair. So I don't know if we want to talk about a little bit more about burnout. I'm certainly curious to hear what other folks have to say about it. It's a hot topic in our organization right now.
Yeah.
Deanna does float tanks. They may become a sponsor of the podcast at some point.
Yeah, honestly, floating is like, I haven't done it for too long. Floating and dogs. Those are my two hot tips. Yeah. It's like an isolation tank where you just are like highly salinated water, and it's like sensory deprivation. And that's exactly what I need. But I think, to go back to one of the questions that Steve asked about why can't they just go back? And it also kind of like resonates from some of the comments that I think you made, Amanda, is about like, sometimes when people say, well, why don't you just go back? I think if people that are listening and having those thoughts, if they could sit and hear some of the stories that I hear on a daily basis, any of us, these truly horrifying tales of people's life experience, that I think that when we recognize the opportunities that Canada can provide, and that the things that people have come through and the things that they are trying to do with their lives here in Canada, it does shock my conscience to think that we're not going to, especially when they're here and they have opportunities that they have started to set up, they've figured out a way to try and get themselves established here. I don't understand why we can't make a place in our society, because I feel that we can. Of course, that's not a that's not a policy. You can't put that in a piece of legislation. But I do think that that kind of human connection is important. But I also entirely agree with you, Juliana, to watch the way that certain people have come through such great adversity and still have this resilience is very inspiring. It makes me feel that the kind of run-of-the-mill, day-to-day trauma that that comes from just everyday life should be quite manageable.
Oh, yeah.
On the topic of burnout, and I have a bit of a hard deadline, so I might have to drop off soon. One of the unique things about you three compared to, say, Deanna or I in private practice is that I would imagine that a component of what could cause burnout are funding issues for not-for-profits. So I think you mentioned legal aid. What other like types of funding do your organizations receive, and like how much of your role almost is satisfying either government donors, private donors, etc.?
Super interesting question. I mean, I can speak to like the IRLC is funded by both the ministry, BC Ministry of the Attorney General, via the Law Foundation, and the Law Foundation of BC. So that's our sort of major major funding source. And, you know, I find that it is, you know, the support that we've received from the Law Foundation has been tremendous. And you know, it's still not a substitute for a fully funded legal aid system. Right? Like, and I think, you know, our clinic was, you know, constituted to try to, you know, act as a safety net for individuals who are at the most risk of falling through the cracks of the traditional legal aid system. Like that's an unmeetable mandate because
How big are
like,
those cracks?
the cracks are not cracks, they're like gaping
There,
holes.
yeah.
So, you know, I think that, you know, when we look to the, you know, like the root causes of that, like, yeah, like like there's a desperate need to rethink how we fund immigration legal services and across the country. And like this is one of the ironies is that so like BC, we all are in a BC context here. You know, BC, we are always comparing ourselves to Ontario and saying like, oh, in Ontario, like, you know, it's like rainbows and they, you know, like they have so many clinics and so many, you know, different, there's the RLO, there's, you know, there's Legal Aid Ontario, you know, issues certificates, etc. And then other provinces are looking at BC and saying like, you guys have a legal aid system. And, you know, many provinces like don't offer immigration legal aid services at all. So it's, yeah, it's quite brutal.
On those
My
cracks, what is
recollection.
covered? Is
Oh,
it
sorry.
just refugee? Is it vulnerable workers
Yeah, so
Legal
at the
aid?
moment,
or
like
legal aid?
legal
Yeah.
aid is covering and you know, I should say this is, you know, I'm not part of legal aid, so this is just my experience as a frequent person who refers to cases to legal aid. So refugee claims that are determined to have a reasonable prospect of success are covered. And you know, I find that the threshold, you know, for that has a reasonable chance of success often can be like a bit of a barrier for folks to navigate because, you know, they might not know, you know, oh, I need to say which cartel from like in Mexico is after me because if it's this cartel, you know, that's going to succeed. Whereas this cartel, you know, they're going to say I have an internal flight alternative in Merida. So, you know, I find that that's a challenge. And, but, you know, beyond refugee claims, like, I mean, Amanda and Jonathan, like jump in if your experience is different, but beyond that, I find that they're funding very little else right now. Like humanitarian and compassion applications, like maybe if you like argue like, you know, and fight and claw tooth and nail to get an H&C covered, because you have to show that there's like a refugee like risk. or, and I think that's a real challenge. Like, for example, the IRLC works with a lot of survivors of domestic violence, some family violence. And, for like a million reasons, they, can't go back and reestablish themselves in the country that they left to come and be with their abusive Canadian spouse. But, they might not have, a Section 96, Section 97 claim that legal aid's going to look at and say, yeah, like we'll fund that. So it's a challenge. And like the clinic, like the IRLC, does, we try to take cases when we can, that kind of, fall in that gray zone, but it's like we can't come anywhere close to meeting the demand. So I don't know, do you guys have different experiences of referring to legal aid? No. Yeah.
And the agency thing, I think that's the big one. Because if you just think of like in your own private practices, those like complex situations where you're like, oh God, like nothing is working here. And the sort of end result is you need potentially a TRP and an agency. It's like, those are the kinds of cases I think that are the most troubling, because you're like, where do you, we all know as practitioners how much work those kinds of applications are. So it's really hard to be like, oh yeah, sure. Okay. I'm going to take that as a private practitioner, and only charge you $2,000, because there's so much work to put together a good application. And it's like, I've just find that we just don't know we don't really refer those people
There's nowhere to refer people. Like, it sucks to have to say in a summary advice appointment, okay, well, you can make an agency application. You can go to legal aid on your own. I don't know if they're going to fund it. Beyond that, you got to hire a private lawyer. We're at capacity right now. Like, I'm really sorry. Good luck with your life. Like, that's brutal. We hate doing that. And so I think this is an area where, I would love to, kind of like leverage the, strength of the private bar to some degree, where it's like, okay, if you're willing to take low bono, if you're willing to, take on a pro bono case, once, in a while, maybe there's a particular country that you specialize in and you already have the country conditions package like ready to go. Or maybe there's a particular profile, maybe you have a particular interest in working with survivors of gender-based violence. And, you're willing to take those referrals, because we have such a difficult time trying to refer cases. And we do often try to do warm referrals, which, is kind of like lining up a referral for someone, whether on legal aid or, or paid. Like, obviously, like, we're just, saying, okay, these lawyers, have availability and, may be willing to meet with you. You need to, like, the steps are yours to take from here. And, Deanna, you're on our list. And I know, Steve, you've done pro bono consults for our clients as well. And it's always much, much, much appreciated. And, this is an area where, like, beyond that, like, I don't, like, we've got to find ways of meeting this need, and like being creative, because, like, pro bono work is not the solution. And so,
I just remember that being in a funded position, I remember there always being a lot of pressure. There was a preference, put it this way, for kind of education and summary advice services over direct representation. I don't know if that's still the case. Obviously, funding organizations always want to kind of get the biggest bang for their buck, and a huge focus on keeping administrative costs low to non-existent. I imagine that continues to be the case. Yeah.
I would say we're lucky in that, because of our kind of like unique purpose, like, we don't, I find that, that is a pressure that I've seen in other contexts, in other organizations. I don't really feel that particular pressure at the IRLC. Like, we almost do exclude, like, we do summary legal advice, because it's an important service, but we do a lot of full representation. We do a lot of, like complex litigation involving, removals, multiple intersecting applications, all going in at once.
That's
That's sort of like our, I mean, we don't really have bread and butter, so to speak, because by the very nature, the cases that we're dealing with are the super complex, messy ones that that are difficult to do on a 16-hour certificate with legal aid. So I think that we're lucky in that regard, in that we don't particularly face that pressure. But I know that from our funders, at least, I think there's a recognition of the value of having, dedicated, having lawyers, like funded staff lawyers available to provide service legal representation in a clinical model where you're not limited by the tariff. I think it's so important to have like a spectrum of different sort of models of service delivery. Like some cases, like maybe easier to serve on the legal aid tariff, and they don't maybe need to go to the clinic, like if you're a Iranian Christian, for example. So that probably doesn't need to come to our clinic, but if you're a person who has come to Canada 10 years ago and you're facing a Section 37 inadmissibility allegation for organized criminality, and you had a HR, agency and PRA application pending and needed to do a stay, like that, those are the types of cases that we're doing, and you can't do those on legal education.
Yeah, 100%.
Do you know what legal aid is? There like a hierarchy? Like I assume it's all a zero-sum game. So if one type of case gets funding, it means one less other type of case.
I think that's the challenge, right? Like it's just underfunded.
I think it ebbs and flows too with like where they're at in their financial, and like in the fiscal year, how much money's left, how much money is coming in from the Fed. So it's like at least I feel like, some times of the year they feel more, it feels like they're more generous with extra hours or funding cases that, you're not like.
My last question before I gotta go, I guess, would be if you were advising, I forget, if you were premier or Law Society president or prime minister, what would you do to make the access to justice system less pressure, to ameliorate the crisis? Like, what are some measures that government, or if you're Law Society president, mandating on lawyers or consultants, I guess, to take?
I mean, there needs to be more funding for sure for legal aid. I think that there's no doubt about that. The federal government, I think, has been stepping in and providing, now the last budget provided a 5-year funding commitment for legal aid, but I think we know it's not enough. But something, Julianne and I have talked about this for years, I think, like, I do think we need to think a little bit more creatively in the immigration bar about like how to most effectively try to help provide services, because I remember when the Immigration and Refugee Legal Clinic was being created, thinking, oh, great, now there's going to be a clinic that can do all the H&Cs, the humanitarian applications that the private bar can't do because they're so time consuming. But then, of course, like within the first, I think, 3 months, you guys were not able to take any more cases because they are so consuming. So I just wonder, like, I don't know if it's about, having a combination of like lawyers, of course, supervising and making sure that legal work is being done properly, but then also some other systems of like having advocates or other paralegals. And I know there's like now a new debate around having licensed paralegals doing work.
Totally.
Yeah, I love the idea of more collaboration and some kind of like a hub organization, because I feel like we can't afford to have any redundancies. And I think, I think informally we're all kind of doing our best to kind of collaborate and be like, hey, do you have a good country package on this? And have you tried this? But I think something more formally set up so that we can resource share, because the department has all of this integration and they're using all these fancy systems that we don't benefit from, just to kind of level the playing field a little bit. I love that idea.
Yeah.
One of the things that we have a pilot project currently right now for a community legal worker who works within our clinic, is supervised by the staff lawyers, and is able to provide support on these cases where clients have really complex accessibility needs. And I think that for our clinic and for others, like that is just such a huge access to justice piece, is building in the support, not only for the clients to be able to access the services and get the support that they need, but also to support like the workers and like the lawyers who are doing this work, to again just resist burnout.
Yeah.
So like some of the things that our community legal worker, who many of you know and who is fabulous, does is like supporting clients with like registering their children in school, accessing medical services coverage. Like folks can't engage with their legal issues if they're in crisis. And so helping and, making referrals to counseling, to, appropriate medical providers that are trauma informed, just providing this like wraparound support is so key. And like, I would like to see more of that in the way that we all provide services.
Awesome.
The idea that there's
I do gotta
no,
run. Thanks for
Okay.
coming
See
on,
ya.
guys. I'll
Yeah.
look forward to listening to the rest of the convo.
Yeah. The
Right.
idea that there's no like counseling or social services support within the refugee board to me is, they talk about providing a compassionate and humane kind of environment. But really, the way that lawyers are trying to like so much goes into these kinds of credibility findings and whether or not there's inconsistencies in somebody's narrative on a basis of claim. But, the fact that lawyers are having to adduce this kind of information. I know we can sometimes get funding from legal aid to get support from the Vancouver Association for Survivors of Torture, but there are so many challenges in trying to get a cogent narrative in the timeframes set up, that I think that there are just vast challenges, and those don't include services during a hearing when people are facing profound challenges related to post-traumatic stress. I
feel like you've talked about this on this podcast before, just like this issue of this sort of dual role. I feel like sometimes as like lawyer, but also, trying to be a social worker without any training, where you're like, you're trying very hard to also support somebody's emotional, and like very concrete needs in terms of housing and whatever it is. But yeah, like just not having the tools to do that.
Because just to do no harm, because when people leave major gaps in their narrative, that is an issue that will profoundly impact the success of their application. But you can sometimes feel like you are really doing harm to your client by pushing and pushing and pushing. And so it's a very difficult call. The idea of like having to provide this expert opinion material, I don't think it's really recognized by the department how challenging it can be to provide that kind of credible report. And I think that if that's something that is required, the idea that there's no, this is part of the access to justice issue, in my view.
Yeah, well, like on vulnerable work open work permits, or I guess any immigration application, if you provide something that's in a different language other than English and French, you have to get a certified translation. And like, well, how is somebody who's just spent $40,000 for a job that doesn't exist and their communications are in whatever other language, how are they supposed to then get that certified translated? Especially when there's no guarantee that you're going to look at their application with grace and care. And so they're going to spend hundreds of dollars just to have you write no on a response form. And I think, so to your question of what can the government do, I think there's the funding issue of making sure that there's people to provide the legal support, but a lot of people shouldn't need to have legal support. I think a lot of these issues are created by the systems and how they're run. Like thinking of, when somebody applies for a bridging open work permit and a PR at the same time, and they refuse them both on the same day. So somebody's suddenly out of status and they need a lawyer, whereas immigration could change something about that so that they have some grace period to be able to apply for something else. Or thinking about filing applications for leave and judicial review, like why do we have to file those to get the reasons? And then why why when the lawyers at the Department of Justice, right, this recent gripe, why are the lawyers at the Department of Justice not actually reviewing the claims to see if there's a valid case before they force us to spend hours and hours and hours on an applicant record just to then settle like 2 days
Right
later?
before,
Yeah.
before the responses.
Yeah. So, I mean, this was kind of my final question, which is about, I'm going to try and make it an actual question and not a comment, which is about the ways in which the accessibility of the system itself has changed. You've started us in on this topic, Jonathan, but access, like accessibility, I'm just wanting to hear your comments in a general way about how accessibility, I mean, the way that the department, I think, would pitch it is that now everything's online, everything's available, everybody can self-help their way through. I just want to hear your own personal comments on how accessibility has either improved or declined over the last few years.
I think that the government's push for, putting everything online, and, there's obviously some advantages to having everything there. People can read it, not that it's always simple to read. But I think what I've seen as the trend from that is that the human, like the officers who are viewing these things, acting like humans, looking at the papers of humans, seems to have deteriorated. Like it just all seems like a zero-sum game, of the sense of, like, I think of like care worker applications where somebody misses like their child's birth certificate, they forget to include that. And instead of what used to happen where people would write a letter and say, hey, can you provide this, now they just say no. And so it feels like this turn towards like everything being online, everything being submitted online. It seems very robotic now, and it feels like it's being treated very robotically, and that's leading to a lot of harm for people. Whereas I think the old paper applications, there just felt like a bit more human of an approach. So yeah, this push to online, just it's turning in that way, and those two things don't need to be as true at the same time, but it just seems the way that it's going.
It does feel like, I mean, this is something I think immigration lawyers have been griping about for many, many years. Like this sort of lack of flexibility, I think, that Jonathan's talking about, where, it would save so many resources if an officer, if instead of sending an application back and refusing an application because somebody maybe forgot to upload or uploaded the wrong document in the education section, instead of uploading their diploma by accident, they uploaded their passport copy again or something, instead of refusing that as incomplete and sending it back, why not just provide an opportunity for people to supplement their applications? Like, it does feel like this sort of, I think immigration is just grappling with like a huge volume of applications and can't quite figure out the best way to like resource the department so that and like get to this sort of sweet spot with respect to efficiency. But it's like, certainly what we're doing right now, I don't think is working. And this move to all these portals, like it's amazing for us as legal representatives to figure, like it's hard enough, I think, for all of us to figure out like which portal am I supposed to use? Okay. And then, I'm not getting a notification in this portal. How often should I be checking to make sure I'm not missing messages? Like, we're legally trained with many years of experience. Hard enough, I think, for us to figure out like, okay, where do things go? And am I doing this right? And it's so fortunate, I think, that we have a community of immigration lawyers who, really do share information and try to help each other. But imagine, yeah, people whose first language isn't English, and particularly the kinds of profiles of people that we work with, very, very vulnerable often. Like, there's just no way. Moving it online, having these inaccessible Adobe forms that don't
Most people
open
can't even open.
I feel like I spend so much time as a lawyer being like, oh, you have to download the latest Adobe. No, you can't open it on your phone. Like,
yeah, you have to save it and then open it. Like, how many times have you said that? Open it from a saved location. Yeah.
Like, what the hell? There's got to be a better way. It's like, there's got to be a better way for like the intake. There's got to be a better way for like the assessments, all this move to AI, which I know is a whole different topic, you know, but like, it's like, yeah, these sort of automatic refusals when things are incomplete, not getting the reasons, like why? There's just, it feels like for those of us who work in this area, it's like there's so many better ways that this could be, and just like resource savings that could be had if you weren't, you know, forcing us to like spend hours and hours trying to log into portals and like, you know, ask for reconsideration when somebody's uploaded the wrong document or whatever.
Yeah. I
And
find
going
that
back-
I just find that when Canadians actually have a reason to interact with the system,
Totally.
like they're like,
Yeah.
this is
Yeah,
what our
totally.
system is. Are you joking me?
Yeah,
Like when it's
100%.
like a
Yeah.
sponsor
Yeah.
and a spousal
Yeah.
application, like that a spousal application will be comprised of 200-300 pages of
Totally.
material for a couple that has a child together, that have been
What exactly?
together.
Yeah.
I mean, just a couple of examples that I have to explain. I spent a day in litigation the other day with a couple that had literally 300 pages of text messages back and forth, like hundreds of pages of photographs of them over the course of years, and remittance statements showing transactions back and forth. And we were like quibbling over these like silly inconsistencies. The man, the sponsor, was schizophrenic, and he went through hours of cross-examination about inconsistencies in material. And it just, is this really what Canadian taxpayer money is being
Exactly.
spent
Yeah.
funding? You know,
Yeah.
like
Yeah.
they're clearly both in love with one another. Like it was just, again,
Yeah.
it was
Like,
quite,
why?
what's the point?
Yeah.
Like, why?
Yeah.
yeah, should a
Um,
Canadian who wants to sponsor their spouse have to employ a lawyer? Like it
Yeah.
really, I wish to be put out of work on these types of cases.
Totally.
This should
Yeah.
It would
not
be
be
great if we
somebody,
were all out of work.
honestly, it should not be this difficult. And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah, for sure.
so yeah,
Yeah.
but I don't think it's ever been so complex. And
Yeah.
sometimes you'll get a group of lawyers trying to figure out what
Yeah.
is this? What is this? Can you explain? You know,
Yeah.
even these latest changes to the caregiver program with the,
Totally.
you
Yeah.
know, like three of us sitting there couldn't figure out what they were
Sure.
trying to
Yeah.
accomplish,
Mhm.
you know?
Yeah.
And so the
Well,
fact that like
And
that
yeah.
people in this program are supposed to be able to figure out how to navigate it is really
Exactly.
mind-boggling.
Yeah.
to go back to Steve's point of like, what would you say to the government? And like on this question of accessibility, like we need a regularization program.
Yes.
Like, we need a simple, accessible program for all of these people who are in like countless, you know, complexities of situations. Like, just take the humane, like compassionate approach and just let people regularize their status. Like, you know, I mean, we'll obviously, like, there's discussion about the exact details of what that looks like, but like I feel like that is what we need.
Yeah.
I mean, at this
Couldn't agree
point,
more. Yeah.
especially because I feel like the system has created like so many situations now, you know, because of, I think, these complexities and because of unscrupulous representatives and the fact that like we are just not doing enough as a country to crack down on that. It's like, yeah, how many people have like found themselves in a situation where they've lost their status and yeah, can't quite figure out how to get themselves back to a place and anyways, back to like another thing we were talking about in the beginning. It's like you meet these people and they've got employers who are like very much willing to help support them, you know, and speaking of like Canadians who can't quite understand why our system is the way it is, like how many times you've met with a person whose employer phones you to be like, well, why can't I just sponsor them? And it's like, well, because they're out of status. Like it just doesn't work that way anymore,
Yeah.
right?
90 days. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what you got.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So
No, great.
there's got to be a better way. And there
Yeah.
is, I'm sure, but
Yeah. Well, I really appreciate all of your time. Did you have any final comments, Jonathan? I see you just took yourself off of mute. I don't want to cut you off before you've had your final word.
No, I just took myself off mute to agree with Julianne about regularization. I think there's just so many, like I think like regularization to a lot of people who aren't aware of this world just scares a lot of people. They're just thinking, oh, like somebody can just come to Canada and become a citizen right away. That's not what this is. There's so many ways that people are losing status, often because of unscrupulous people, often because of our really weird bureaucracy that just doesn't like treat humans like humans. And yeah, like we just need regularization. I think if people actually heard these stories from these people, that they would agree. And I encourage people who are scared of that idea to read up a bit more on it and think a bit and hear these stories before jumping to that conclusion.
I think also, I think Canada likes to congratulate itself on its grand humanitarian tradition, but I think when it comes right down to it, I think there does seem to be a real failure to own its own problems. And I think sometimes this is really a moment where there have been a lot of missteps in the immigration portfolio over the last few years. Now there has been kind of a bunch of blaming around the international students. Oh, you know, this is what's happening and we need to step back. Okay, well, be that as it may, the students that came here to Canada came here on the promise of being able to gain permanent residency. I don't think Canada's ever denied that. All of these people were admitted on various grounds, and I think they're now here. And so I think this disconnect between temporary residency and permanent residency has long been a problem. And I think the idea of of trying to make right on those missteps. I think I entirely agree with all of you that regularization is a way of doing that. And in fact, we did do a small kind of regularization in the middle of the pandemic where the department said, if you lost status even more than 90 days ago, you can restore. And the sky did not fall. So
I was so sad when that ended. That was
I
so helpful to
know
so
it
many
was
people.
it was so amazing. And yeah, it really
And
was
finally, like
amazing.
a recognition, right, of like the complexities and the vulnerabilities. And yeah, exactly. It's like,
Yeah.
and I
And
think, I
like
mean,
just the simplicity, right? Like,
Yeah.
and clients really benefited from
Yeah.
that rather than having to like,
Yeah.
hire a lawyer and spend $10,000 going to federal court or, having a clinic like lawyer litigate for you. Like, it's just like, okay, we can just restore, like, it's easy.
I think the public needs to know too that the department has been using artificial intelligence in a non-beta tested kind of an environment.
Oh yeah, for sure.
And so the amount of refusals that have arisen where like they're kind of like just errors.
Oh yeah. No, I had a case like a couple months ago where it was a woman who has a pending PRA. And like it couldn't be clearer. She's gotten several unenforceable removal order work permits, like R206B work permits, like in the past. And like it was just like the decision came back, it was refused. And it was like client is under an enforceable removal order. And it was just like, it was just wrong.
No,
But like, and it so happened that, she's a client of of our legal clinic. And so we were, able to file a federal court application for judicial review and resolve that. But like, it shouldn't come to that.
Yeah, I know. I mean, we've had cases too where we've had several where they asked for an additional fee and the person uploaded the fee, but then didn't realize they had to resubmit the entire application. Have you seen those too?
So many things.
Heartbreaking.
So many. And it's like, again, the user experience on the portal is so poor that like, and the portal can show application uploaded, received, and so these are smart, intelligent people who are just operating with a very complicated system, and that mistake can cost people. One of these clients has been in Canada for years and years, gained a degree, eligible for a post-graduation work permit. It is now, oh, sorry, you have to go home and now you don't qualify for the post-graduation work permit any longer. And it's, again, they're just shocking stories. I've had two cases for sure where they said, oh no, you can't apply, you're beyond the period of restoration, you're out of status, but in fact they were on maintained status. So it's, again, within their own records. They're not, and so again, these are just like, but again, doing a judicial review application, hundreds of pages of material that need to be filed in order to get that done. And so, yes, I do agree. And I 100% encourage other lawyers to offer low bono and pro bono services. But again, the fact that this is relying on the generosity of lawyers to do this work in order to remedy some of these problems, and given the slowness of settlement offers, it's not a fix.
It's not. And I just also want to add, like, the impact. We can't lose sight of the fact that the people who are, experiencing this, this marginalization within our legal system, like, the impact is
Mhm.
tremendous, like on
Yeah.
our clients. Like, you know, erroneous refusals cause mental health crises, panic attacks. Like I've had clients have to go to the ER, and they've not been covered because their medical services plan, their like BC healthcare coverage got cut off when their work permit was erroneously refused.
Yeah.
And so now we're looking at like not only mental health impacts, we're looking at physical health impacts, we're looking at, you know, corollary impacts on families, on children, seeing their parents go through this incredible stress and confusion and not understanding why the system is treating them this way.
Yeah.
And I just want to emphasize like the human cost and the impact on people
Yeah.
is really like, it's really serious, and it
Yeah.
needs to be accounted for.
Yeah, we can do better. That's what I keep doing. I'm tired of doing that. What are we doing? What
Yeah.
are we doing? Why are we, well, you know, and so that's at an all-time high for me right now. So yeah. Anyways, I appreciate all of you. Thank you so much for all of your good work. And anyways, I'm sure we will have good reason to connect in the days and weeks and months to come. But I thank you for being here today and sharing your thoughts.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much,
Deanna.
Deanna.
Thank you,
Okay.
Stephen.
Yeah. Bye all.
Bye.
Bye.